Amen.
Amen.
Okay, the intended plan was for Sister Kathy McGraw to bring her findings and present them to you today. So I'll be your substitute teacher in that case. And what I would like to do is direct our minds to North American history. And in discussing this history, there's more history than we can cover in an hour's time or anything like that. So what I may do is anytime I have a chance to use it for teaching or studying in our group is to discuss American history. When we're discussing the American history, what I would like for you to have in the back of your minds is to think of, look at it from a Christian perspective, and maybe even try to imagine how God looks at North America, both before it became a prominent nation, while it was developing, how it is now. I think it's easy for us to admit we have great faith and confidence that God had a very significant influence in the development of the United States of America. So really what I would like to do is discuss this history with that in mind, how God has influenced the country, the reason for bringing it about, things like that. And to try to see if we can separate the myths, the reasons why we think this country became so prominent, that are based on superstition or things that aren't so historically accurate. If we could separate that stuff from how the country actually developed, its true history. What I'd like to do to introduce us to this subject is just read from Great Controversy, page 441. It may also include page 440. I'll just write the number 1 up there, because that's the only reference I have on my paper, but just keep in mind it may be more than just that page. This will just be to introduce us to the subject. What nation of the New World was in 1798 rising into power, giving promise of strength and greatness and attracting the attention of the world? The application of the symbol admits of no question. One nation, and only one, meets the specifications of this prophecy. It points unmistakably to the United States of America. Again and again, the thought, almost the exact words of the sacred writer, has been unconsciously employed by the orator and the historian in describing the rise and growth of this nation. The beast was seen in the rise of the United States, speaks of the mystery of her coming forth from vacancy, and says, like a silent seed, we grew into an empire. The New World compared with the Old. Wait, I'm reading from a quote, it looks like. So, skipping all that. It says, a European journal in 1850 spoke of the United States as a wonderful empire, which was emerging, and amid the silence of the earth, daily adding to its power and pride. Edward Everett, in an oration on the Pilgrim founders of this nation, you have to excuse me, the last page of my notes, the ink started going up. The Pilgrim founders of this nation said, did they look for a retired spot, inoffensive for its obscurity, and safe in its remoteness, where the little church of Leyden might enjoy the freedom of conscience? Behold the mighty regions over which, in peaceful conquest, they have borne the banners of the cross. Okay, so there's one thing I would like to pick up on right from the beginning here. It's that this country wasn't vacant. It's not empty. It was people already here, the Native Americans. So keep that in mind, because we'll be discussing them pretty soon. Then continuing on, it says, and he had 2 horns like a lamb. The lamb-like horns indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness, fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. Among the Christian exiles who first fled to America and sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance, were many who determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. I would like to make a comment there. People who came to this country were not only pilgrims or religious people. And they weren't the first ones here either. There were other countries that came to this land. Spain was already, the Spanish. They were already trying to populate certain areas. They weren't doing so well in Florida because of the terrain there. But they were doing a little bit better over in the western part of the United States. But they were causing a lot of trouble over there, which we'll discuss pretty soon as well. Continuing on with the quote, it says, their views found place in the Declaration of Independence, which sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles, this is very important. I think we all know this, but I want to stress how important this is. It says, these principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. The oppressed and downtrodden throughout Christendom have turned to this land with interest and hope. Millions have sought its shores, and the United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations of the earth. The secret to its power is, how did it say it? Republicanism and Protestantism. What's so good about this is that it allows the oppressed and downtrodden to come here and live a life of liberty, right? This is very important because it shows you in how this country is developing from its beginning. It's promising freedom to people. It's a land where people can just choose how they want to live, right? It's in that way, it's very similar to both Christianity and God, because God gives us a choice whether we would love him or not. And then Christianity, I think the way it was meant to be was as Christians, you want to present the opportunity of salvation to people. You want to tell them the plan of salvation, the gospel story. But that's all you can do. All you can do is plant seeds for people. You can't actually compel them to become Christian. I'm pretty confident that this is how original Christianity was, as we see it in the New Testament. You can even see that Jesus ministered to the Jews that way. He presented to them the correct interpretations of things that were wrong on. He presented to them the principles of the law, the principles of what it meant to be a follower of God, or that true religion. If we could just say, when I'm using the word religion in this case, if you could just discount all other religions, so we're only talking about worshiping God. He showed the Jews, he strove to show them how they had it wrong and what it actually was, how it actually looked. And I think both looking at how Jesus taught the Jews and how the Christians followed him afterwards and spread the gospel, that we can see these Christians didn't invent some sort of a system that was compelling people to worship God. It wasn't forcing them, it wasn't trying to add additional burdens to people. It was just trying to teach them how to be like Christ, how how to grow into a character that is more compatible with heavenly life, as if in the future you're going to eventually be restored into the company of God, angels, and other fellow believers who are already dead, like Adam, Abraham, things like that. So it's very comparable, the setting of the United States, to some themes like that. And this was necessary, I think we all agree, during that time, because Europe was, at this point in time, we could say, if we start considering history from like the 1600s, I rarely ever write, so I usually type. So I'm not very good at writing things. So if we just consider the 1600s and onward, we know around this time Europe is in a condition that's been shaped in a really bad way by oppressive government and oppressive religion. So we've had the Catholic Church involved in state affairs, to where things in Europe, the way government is being utilized, it's an oppressive form of government. It's restricting liberties that just to say in a little bit of humor, things that you don't have any business controlling for people. This is what the governments were doing. So after reading that and emphasizing this secret of the power of this nation, which is the republicanism and Protestantism, I would like to ask you guys, how familiar are you with the history of the United States? Are you able to point out how it developed? Because it didn't just happen in 1798. How much do you know about it? Let's raise your hand if you know little. Okay, that's pretty much all of us. Now I'm in the same boat, and I think this is why I had this idea. Let's talk about United States history, because we have people like Tess who are running circles around us, and she's not even American. Now this is fine. I'm not saying that from a prideful perspective, but it is alarming because we are not only just United States of America citizens, we are Seventh-day Adventists who are in this country. And we have been adversely affected by not being familiar with our history. Both the secular side, if you want to say it's even secular. I have my doubts that we can confidently do that because God was so involved in it. When we're discussing the history, I would like to show you how God must have been involved in it, because just looking at what we're going to discuss today, it makes it seem like we were heading in the same direction as Europe was. We had a bunch of Christians coming here who were doing the same form of government that they had over there. Just, they were free from Catholicism. But they were exacting the same sort of requirements on people as the Catholic Church was doing over there in Europe. So it didn't look good. It was really a bleak situation. This, when it started colonizing the Americas, and we'll look into that. So I think it's good for us to discuss it. I think it might be beneficial to us for us to know the history of the United States. Who knows how it might be beneficial, but I think it's worthwhile because knowing both our history and how it ties into eventually the Millerite movement, and then the Seventh-day Adventist Church comes into that. All the history, really, in discussing how this nation developed up until 1989, it's all full of information that's useful to us. I personally used to think otherwise. I used to look at, 1840 to 1844, that happened, it was a great disappointment. The Seventh-day Adventist Church came about, and there was something that happened about 1888. We messed up there. And then this gap between 1888 and now, the time that I was alive, right? This is the 1990s, the 2000s. I'm thinking none of what's happening now is significant because the Bible talks about the Sunday law and things like that, and we're not at all. There's no Sunday law even on the horizon. You just can't see it, right? So you're thinking, what's the point of the world wars? What's the point of the Cold War? Is any of this stuff biblical? But reading the Bible without understanding the reform lines, the parables and things like that, you don't get it. You completely miss that all of this history, in between, let's say, 1888 till 1989, all of it is very valuable to us. So, I'm not really good at history. I'm not a historian. I have a lot of trouble finding sources. But fortunately, we have some to discuss this morning in regards to the United States. So, I would like to discuss the Native Americans first. We're just going to discuss some characteristics of the people who are already in the United States, then the people who are starting to come here to colonize it. When we're discussing Native Americans, what you might be interested to know is they did not have metalwork, they did not have gunpowder, they didn't use wheels, they had no written language. Because they had no written language, you have to keep in mind we have no real perspective of the Native Americans, because they probably would have written their own version of the history, right? So just keep that in mind. They had no domesticated animals. The animals that they used, they were either hunting or they just were like free roaming. Very interesting people. They didn't keep, if they had herds of animals, they were just they went wherever they went. There was no, you have to stay in this fence, you have to stay in this area, nothing like that. They did farm. They did have complex social systems, like there was classes in their groups. And they traded with each other. They had widespread trade networks across the nation because of resources. You had Native Americans on the West Coast who had different resources than Native Americans in the Midwest. They would trade with each other to exchange things that they had surplus of and that they had little of. So you trade your surpluses for things that the other groups of Native Americans had surpluses to accommodate your need for the things that you had less of. Let's see now. Were they, having discussed them this far as we have, are they any less valuable as human beings? What if they wanted to stay primitive? What if they were okay with not having wheels, gunpowder, metalwork? Should we force it on them anyway? If you were a colonist, think of it from that perspective. So what if you come to a country, there's people already here, they're very technologically not advanced as you are. Is it okay for you to force that on them if they don't want it?
No. Yeah.
You say yes.
Because if you have more information, isn't it your duty to share it with them, regardless of what it actually might bring about? I mean, if you truly believe that you have more advantageous systems, you would be compelled to share it with others who didn't know those things, like how to transport water more efficiently or stuff using wheels. I think there was a big sharing going on between the two at first. I don't think it had I'll let you finish, but I don't think it initially had the negative nobody intended for a negative impact, I don't think. But I think that they wanted to share their knowledge with the native.
So you're looking at it from the perspective of, well, we have these things, they don't. We'll show it to them.
How much more effective is a gun at killing an animal than a spear? I mean, I think they're seeing their methods of having this technology of being an advantage. And
So you would do it as a benefit to them. You'd be, your intentions are good.
I guess I'm putting myself in the hypothetical situation of history, not necessarily what I would do presently, because I would let them be. But how I see it unfold, how I saw it unfold in history, was that it was shared because the colonists thought that they had better ways than these uncivilized savages.
Historically, it was, like you're saying, it was like kind of a natural process. The reason why I'm asking the question, though, is more of a thought question. The question being very simple. If you had technological advancements, you come upon a group of people who don't, do you think it's okay to force? What if, like, here's my question. What if the primitives see everything you have but decide we'd rather stay the way we are? There's people on Earth today who still do that. Is that okay? Should we force the technology on them? I think this is linked to a person's freedom, their liberty. You know, if you come to a whole other culture and you say, well, you guys are not up to date, and you try to introduce them to better things, just take a look at the Middle East. As bad as things might look there, we might say, oh, those people are living in I know soldiers who went over there and have visually observed the terrible conditions that they live in. You might even think that going there to enforce those things upon them is good. You might think you're doing the right thing. But what if those people there would rather you don't? They're just fine with the way they're living, even if it's bad conditions. These are hard questions, right? Because when it comes to matters of health, you want to improve people's chances of surviving. What if they're resistant, which we have observably seen with the United States Army trying to improve things over there in the Middle East. They try to encourage those countries to build up a better infrastructure, make things at least healthier, and the people just destroy it all. More acts of terror, and they still hate the United States. So, maybe we don't have an answer this morning, but you have to wonder, is the United States of America justified in going over and doing what it's doing? Is it really justified? Continuing on with the Native Americans, though. And really, I just wanted to bring out that question to make us think. Because how does God deal with humankind in these ways? I think God does encourage us to be efficient, to be healthy, and things like that. But when we resist the advancements that God is presenting to us, what does He do? Okay, back to the Native Americans. Okay, there were populations of Native Americans that were severely reduced by disease. So people are coming from Europe. Unfortunately, they're bringing the microbes that have never really been introduced to the United States, the Americas, North Americas in that time. And a lot of the population of the Native Americans just was wiped out by disease. One thing to keep in mind is the Native American tribes often united, as primitive as they were, they still did this thing. They united in confederacies. A well-known confederacy was the Iroquois Confederacy. I think they were called the People of the Longhouse. They got into these confederacies for facilitating trade and resources among the various tribes. So they had diplomacy, right? They had this sort of ideal that we are promoting with things like the United Nations. They already were doing that. They just didn't have, oh, that's not good. They just didn't have metal and wheels and other advanced technologies. But I like to see that even though they weren't technologically advanced, they demonstrate they're intelligent, they're wise. They're just as capable of intelligence and wisdom as any other human was. In many ways, they were, all the technological advancements aside, they were superior to the colonists, because the colonists would come and would just die because they weren't farming or things like that. They weren't accustomed to the land. The land was killing them. And there's different reasons for that, and that's why you have it that thanks to the Native Americans, the colonists were able to keep surviving. Let's discuss their religion. Most of the Native American groups believed in one creator who was above all other deities. So they did worship other gods. Now, if you consider this, it sounds very similar to the sort of paganism that you have in the Old Testament. Most, I think at least before the flood, most people knew about the Creator, but they began to worship other gods. So that's, and I think from the perspective of that sort of time before the flood, you have heathens who are worshiping idols that they made, but they still know that the Creator is the one who created everything. And if we consider their social interactions, their society, they encouraged kinship, extended family, and they had clans that bound people together within a system of mutual obligation and respect. Lineage and heritage was central to determining status and responsibilities. Consent held communities together, and concepts of reciprocity extended to gender roles and divisions of authority. So what is reciprocity?
Reciprocation.
What is reciprocation?
Like I do something and you respond accordingly. Like we're both working together. It's not just one person.
So you're saying there's a response back to a catalyst. Like I give you fish.
And then maybe you give me corn.
Yeah. Or maybe something simpler. I did this gesture to you, then they come back with another nice gesture, right?
Yeah. Like teamwork.
What would reciprocity being extended to gender roles mean? Do you have any ideas?
This is a guess using the context clues, but like male and female, there was things expected of both of them, and maybe it wasn't as
Okay, would we, in defining reciprocity or reciprocation, does reciprocation obligate? Is obligation?
No, it's like an unspoken thing. Like it's not enforced, it's not obligation, it's not like commands. It's just like it's an unspoken thing that you respond accordingly. Like if I were to help, okay, I'm here helping you garden, naturally you would come to my aid without me having to demand. It's just like a natural, like a balanced response, you know?
Balance?
Like teamwork. You know?
What about this? What if it simply refers to the gender roles were defined just by necessity, not by
Like a law.
religion. Reciprocity in gender roles
That makes sense.
is they figured out what was efficient, what worked.
Mhm.
So the women would be doing farming and things like that. The men would be doing hunting, carrying on trade. They were more public. They would go on the long trips. There would be the warriors. They would do the fighting. How does that sound?
So basically, it's like the roles flesh themselves out. Like
Based
it wasn't.
on what worked for the
Yeah.
society, but it wasn't really determined by gender.
That was my understanding, is that they didn't have assigned gender. I mean, yeah, women were the only ones giving birth, but it was actually the women who were better skilled hunters than the men, from my understanding. So maybe there were also female warriors too. I don't think
Some tribes did have.
I don't think that they had, like, the men cooked. It wasn't just a women thing. My understanding was that there was a give and take is also how I see reciprocity. That
Give and
there was,
take. Yeah.
Balance to the workload.
Yeah, it seemed like their society was more just trying to work with each other. There wasn't some sort of antagonism among the sexes. Let's see. So we discussed some of this. The women tended to manage internal operations of the community. They usually owned the family's housing, household goods, reared the children. Because women's activities were central to communities' welfare, they also held important political, social, and economic power. In some tribes, women were still important to, the social and political stuff, but they would only have men actually holding office. And it was because women were often busy with the household stuff. But that was only in some tribes.
Actually, especially with the Iroquois, it was the grandmothers that decided who the chiefs would be, who the
Yep.
rulers were. It was called the Council of the 13 Grandmothers.
Yes. We mentioned that in here. It says, in many North American societies, clan membership and material goods descended through women. They practiced matrilineal descent. The clan matrons selected men to serve as their chiefs, and they deposed, chiefs depending on their performance. So, if you just look at what we've discussed so far, they may not be as technologically advanced as the Europeans, but socially they were more advanced from the perspective that the Europeans were bringing in other ideologies as far as how society should work. And we'll get to that. That's what I would like to do. I'd like for you to see, as we're discussing this, compare society of the Native Americans to what the Europeans were doing when they were colonizing.
Can I say something? Because you brought up the lineage.
Matrilineal, so it's lineage by the mothers.
The Jews did the same thing.
Did they?
Yes. This is something that I found out after World War II, I think, that they were trying to figure out how the Jews belonged to one another, I guess, and they, like the diaspora spread out the Jewish nation, but they would count who was Jewish based on their mother's side, not the father's.
Interesting.
I think that's Jews from, that was the impression I got, was that it was
That's how they.
Jewish system,
I
know.
mean, when you read the Bible, you get the impression it's male,
Right.
but Mary was who Jesus descended from.
Okay.
So the lineage was being carried. At least we could see. We probably should look at it more closely, but at least you could see Mary's lineage was just as valuable because it wasn't a man. So I think Mary was the one who descended from Judah. So was Joseph. I have to check on Joseph. But all right, let's continue. Men. Well, we discussed men already. Let's see. Let's talk about an observation made by a Dutch person who came to North America around that time. He said that Native American women were obliged to prepare the land, to mow, to plant, and do everything. The men do nothing except hunting, fishing, and going to war against their enemies. Many of his fellow Europeans, this guy who visited, described American Indian women as slaves to the men because of the perceived differences in their labor compared to European women. Indian women, or Native American women, performed what Europeans considered to be men's work, but from the Native American perspective, women's roles reflected their own cultural emphasis on reciprocity, balance, and autonomy. So here's the difference. The Europeans would not have their women doing the farming. They thought this is a male job. Males do the farming. And here you have in Native American society, women are doing the farming. This is, if you just look at it simply, this is no big deal. This is two different cultures. There's nothing inherently born into a man or a woman that determines what they should be doing. Their society, the way they were living, is what brought about these circumstances. Native Americans, at least the ones that were observed here, they found the way they were running their society worked. To them, it was okay for women to be farming. The Europeans come, and we know what sort of mindsets that they're affected by. They grew up in the European system, that society, which was unfortunately so hindered, so influenced by oppressive government. And they even use Christianity as a foundation, an excuse to prove gender roles. Many tribes, but not all, promoted some degree of balance of power among the two genders. There were some Native American tribes that were what's the word for male?
Masculine.
Masculine is not the word I want. They actually diminished the females. They weren't so equal. It's just a male-based society that they had. The males were the priority, they were the primary, they're in power. And women, it was very similar to
Patriarchal.
patriarchal is a good one. It's very similar to how things were with the Christians when they came over. The women were not that important. Gender roles were split based on sexes, is what I'm trying to say, with males being in dominance. Okay, now let's discuss immigration real briefly. Now we're switching from Native Americans to talk to the people that are coming to the country. First, we'll talk about the Spanish. The Spanish immigrants introduced religious persecution. This was Christianity. This is the first impression of Christianity that's presented to the Native Americans. Persecution. They introduced this by trying to convert Native Americans and purge out any other native religions. So they come, they consider them heathen, they're worshiping other gods and idols. We know for a fact that the Spanish themselves were just worshiping an idol of their own. So they're presenting the image of the beast, really, to the Native Americans. It's an oppressive religion that they have. They've given it the name Christianity. And I guess, is justified by that. We know how twisted Catholicism was. This sort of oppression, though, brought about resistance from the Native Americans who would revolt against the oppression, and so they were at war. They wouldn't just take it. They wouldn't tolerate it. It gets to a point where they eventually fight against, revolts, uprisings. Unfortunately, the English used this, they're very pragmatic. They used this adversarial relationship between the Spanish and the Native Americans to say, hey, we're coming in to help you, Native Americans. But the English did the very same thing to the Native Americans. They just were taking advantage of the misery on both parts. The first English colony was Virginia. It was not a colony of Pilgrims or Puritans. The purpose of the colony, and this was in Jamestown in 1607. The purpose was to find gold, so they just came there to make money. Colonization. England is interested in using the resources of this new nation. They're also putting their influence on the nation so that they can hold territory in that nation. It's very reasonable. There's nothing mysterious or religious about this. It's really selfish, actually. The interests of a country. That was their first colony. Many of the personnel, as a result, they come to try to look for gold. A lot of the people they sent here were metalsmiths or jewelers. And they weren't finding any gold, so eventually they all start dying because to continue living, they have to farm, but that's not their line of work, right? So they're very much like us in that case, where, like, take me for example, I do computer work, and if I was to go to a different place and look for a job, I'd be looking for computer work. But say they have a bunch of opportunities doing retail or food. Well, what if I say, I don't want to do retail or food, I want to do computer work? And then I gradually decline in my success, my money making, because I just fit in a certain place and can't do the other things. This was the case for them. Their population gradually decreased. A lot of them were dying. The colony was failing because they needed food, but a lot of them were just not farmers. They did things to handle it. They sent people. This made the colony not popular. People were like, people are just dying. We don't want to go there. So the government made incentives to get people over there. Eventually they fixed that. Farmers, they arrive at the colony and tobacco becomes the lucrative product that they are able to produce there. And that's how the colony flourishes. It's because of tobacco. And as a drug, it was popular with people, and England was making a lot of tax revenue off of it. Now, the tobacco industry encouraged the society of the colony. So keep that in mind. The way that this colony worked was you had a very small group of rich, powerful people. The holders of the plantations. You had a very large working class, and then you also had indentured servants. So these are people who go there to serve for a certain amount of time, and they were given incentives. After they served their term, they would also be given land to make their own and live in the new world. Most of the time, though, the people would die. This also affected the demographics. Most of the population was male, and marriages were rare because of the lack of females, so new births were not occurring very frequently in the colony. Then we could discuss the Massachusetts Bay colonization. This is the one that's more religious, the one we're more probably familiar with. This is where we could talk about Puritans and Pilgrims. The deal with the Puritans and Pilgrims, what I learned is they disagreed with the ways of Catholicism, and they also opposed England's church. England's church wasn't Catholic, it was Protestant. But they thought England's church was still too similar to Catholicism. And they were protesting against that too. So, I think what's important to note is on the Pilgrim's Way to America, they wrote up an agreement. It was called Just and Equal Laws. So I guess when they were in the ship, they decided what would be considered just and equal laws. And this is important because you see the beginnings of government in the North American colonies here. When we were discussing Jamestown, Virginia, you don't really see government. It's more like a corporation went there to try to make money off of a place. And you can see that things didn't really work out ideally. It was just like a money-making endeavor. It wasn't really a self-governed society. It was just very much still attached to England, and they were just trying to use the resources and make money there. And it really determined how the colony even works, the society of it, mostly male, large working class, and things like that. But here you have people who are trying to come up with ways to actually govern themselves, and they're coming up with ways. Their intention is just, what was it?
Just and equal laws.
Just and equal. So now they arrive there and they have troubles actually surviving because they're not used to the lands. They didn't bring any livestock or anything like that. They were not prepared to survive the winter. And the Native Americans helped them, with food and resources. If the Native Americans hadn't gotten involved, I think this is important, these colonists probably would not have made it. They probably would have all eventually perished. And now, if we're here understanding that God has his hand in how this country is developing, well, think of how it actually works out. And we know God works through human beings. And so here you have the success of the colony being assisted by Native Americans. Now, what I'd like to do is look into the mindset of these religious people, the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Their mindset is very different than I think what we would expect. Maybe because we have this idea of being Americans, some people, I guess you would say the people who tend to sympathize with Trump or Ronald Reagan, all the religious types, they would say, oh, this country was founded on Christianity. It was a Christian country. We followed God from the beginning of this country and ever after. And they have this idea that the country is in a bad place right now because it has backslided. So let's consider what the religious people were thinking back in those times when they were colonizing. They said they had this idea that the common good should be put above the needs of the individual. So that is not very Republican, because Republican is individuals have rights, and the common good should not infringe upon the individual's rights. So that's opposite to the secret of the nation's power. They had this early ideological concept from a sermon. So this was put into thought that the individual needs were not as important as the needs of the group. It was a sermon given by someone there I think his name was John Winthrop, at least the last name is Winthrop. And it's interesting to note that Ronald Reagan, when he was leaving office, he quotes Winthrop. He quotes that sermon. So he's promoting that sort of religious approach to being a country. Now, do you agree with that? Do you agree with Winthrop when he says, we as a nation, our common good should be placed as a higher priority than the rights of the individual? I think we wouldn't agree with it because we understand the secret of this nation's power is republicanism and Protestantism. And Republican defends the individual. Social inequality was promoted and considered an expression of God's will. Social inequality. This society promoted social inequality and thought it's God's will. It's God's will because free men are different than women. Women are different than children. Servants are even less. Early government was a mix of churchcraft and statecraft. This is undeniable. To even be part of government there was cases where you had to be a Christian. You had to be a Christian in good standing. Now, how would they evaluate that? There's different ways. It depended on what property you held, your status in the church. I wish I remembered what they based that on. It was something superficial. It wasn't based on grace. Like, we're all members of the church because we've accepted God's salvation, right? We've been baptized. We've decided we want to follow Jesus. That's what makes us members of the church. For them, there was more outward measurements, more, you can't really judge a person's character, their heart. You can only see what they do on the outside, and this is what they based Christianity off of, to be in good standing. For an example of how this was blended, this churchcraft and statecraft, they would enforce teaching Bible to the kids. It was punishable. When I say enforce, they said you, as parents, should teach your kids to read the Bible. Now, as great as that might be, as educational as it is, if they didn't do it, by law, they can punish the parents. They can kick them out of the colony, excommunication, things like that. When there was people who had a different opinion, say Roger Williams, he called for religious tolerance. Him doing that got him banished from the colony. So he said, we should be tolerant of religions. So he's actually promoting the secret of this nation's power. And the early colonies, their approach was to get him out of here, that we don't need that sort of ideology, being spread among us. This leads us to this other interesting thing. Propaganda was actually used against the Native Americans. So it was used to discourage people from going to live with the Native Americans because actually there were cases where that was more desirable than living in the colony. And this is all while colonists are seeking to acquire more land from the Native Americans. And this thing, trying to acquire more land from them and all other factors included as well, it results in warfare between the colonists and the Native Americans. And so they use propaganda to tell things about the Native Americans various ways. They would say, oh, if you get captured by them, they'll treat you poorly. But there were also American colonists who treated them fairly, and when they wrote about them, you could see their version of it is that if you were taken prisoner by the Native Americans, they actually treated you good. So there's conflicting views on that. I think it's just interesting to see that you have in early colonies of the United States, you've got this religious church statecraft going on, propaganda to encourage citizens to stay where they're at, to keep living where they're living, resistance to advanced ideologies, like just let people worship however they want. Even there's a lady in the church, she was a woman who resisted, she had this idea that their Christianity, their membership in the church shouldn't even be based on those outward things. She was saying it should just be that we're Christians, that God has given us grace. That's what she was promoting. And they also exiled her because, one, she was a woman, and two, she was teaching these strange things, right? In her exile, though, she was killed by Native Americans. So it's a very dangerous society back then in the United States. Wasn't the United States yet, but those colonies, it was could I say volatile? If you wanted to live here, it was risky. And as we're bringing this to a close for now, I just want to close up with more on the mindset of the Puritans. This is from a chapter in a Massachusetts law from 1675. It's called Preamble to Certain Orders of the General Court of Massachusetts. This is what it says. This is how they were thinking. The righteous God has heightened our calamity and given commission to the barbarous heathen to rise up against us and to become a smart rod and severe scourge to use in burning and depopulating several hopeful plantations, murdering many of our people of all sorts, and seeming, as it were, to cast us off, and putting us, the way they spelled things back then was weird, and putting us to shame, and not going forth with our armies hereby speaking aloud to us to search and try our ways, and turn again unto the Lord our God, from whom we have departed with a great backsliding. So they were thinking all this trouble they were having was because they backslided from God. What do you think? Were they backsliding from God? Does true Christianity require these things that they were doing? They were conducting government in a very disagreeable way, right? We know that that's not the way God would have it because this country didn't turn out that way. We know that early Christianity, with Jesus and the disciples, and for the next 100 years, wasn't that way. Christians weren't going around, determining your membership in the church by such outward things like your works or property you own, things like that. But here you have these people who are doing all of those things. They're governing their colony in a way that has Christianity so interlaced with it. And then when things go bad, they think we're backsliding from God. He's allowing the Native Americans to kill us, to harm us. Were the Native Americans, is that true? Is that what God was doing? These are difficult questions here because there is this, I don't think we've solved this question, but we know the Native Americans they're treated badly by the colonization. Some people may have this idea that, oh, well, they were heathen, pagans, that was God punishing them. Maybe other people, kind of like the Old Testament approach, right? That God used the Jews to destroy all the people in the Promised Land. Is that what we're dealing with the Native Americans? Are we dealing with some sort of hold off until their cup of their iniquity is full, and then the colonization will happen and they'll all be wiped out? Or does that not apply? I think that's interesting in itself, and I don't think we've dealt with it. But I think in this case, so far from what we've looked at, we can see, if we compare the Native Americans to the European colonists, the society of the Native Americans was more Republican than the society of the European colonies. So it makes you wonder, were the Native Americans really so bad? Was God using them to punish the colonists? Was God using the colonists to punish the Native Americans? How was God involved in this thing? Just looking at it from my perspective right now, it just seems like that's how Satan wanted things. We know that Satan loves to see people killing each other and harming each other and mistreating each other. He loves oppression, things like that. So, yeah, how we sort this out, I think is important. We may need more time to do that. It may not even be a matter of present truth where we never study it and realize it until later in the future. But this is as far as we're getting right now. We've gotten to around 1675, where we can read that the people in the colonies thought they were having such trouble because they were backsliding from God. And just keep that in mind, because in our nation today, I think you could see the same concept, the same mindset. They think our country is in a bad state because we've gotten away from God. And this is how we're looking at the end of United States of America history. And I thought it was pretty astounding to see that at the beginning of United States of American history, you have that same mindset. And it wasn't leading to good results. It led to warfare and other sorts of turmoil like that. So, having said all that, we'll go ahead and close now. Gracious Father, we would like to come before you to once again thank you for the Sabbath, for the time that we're able to spend with you and with each other. We would like to ask that you continue to be with us throughout this time. Please continue to help us to take advantage of it. We know that there is much for us to learn, both about you, about your plans for the future, the prophecies that we are looking forward to. You know that we can use this time as opportunity to really just let the things of the world go and focus on you so we could become more like you. So in that way, we'd like to ask that you help us to take advantage of it, no matter what time is remaining and no matter what else happens. We would also like to ask for you to help us during this time that we're living in now to continue to be encouraging to each other, to help each other to stay faithful and confident in all the things that we've learned that you have revealed to us. And please help us to continue in growth and understanding the present truth, the things that are being revealed for our time, the direction that our country is heading. Just please help us to be able to grow and be useful for your plans, whatever they may be in the future, for us specifically. We would like to ask for your wisdom and encouragement in knowing how we could be of assistance and service to each other. And that's the last thing I have. So I would like to ask that you also just remember all of the requests we've already made. See to them in accordance with your will. And we pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.